At my uncle's wedding, the usual family chaos was in full swing. It wasn't the laughter-filled chaos you expect at weddings, the kind that feels warm and welcoming. No, this was the kind of noise where the smiles were too wide, the laughs a little too forced, and the words carefully sharp, like every compliment was a prelude to a jab. The country club banquet hall was grand, all gilded frames and crystal chandeliers, the scent of rich perfume mingling with the faint smell of industrial floor polish. Everything about the place screamed wealth, down to the perfectly ironed white tablecloths and the dessert table that looked like it had its own security detail. Guests moved around like polished mannequins, exchanging pleasantries with their practiced smiles. And there I was, doing what I've done for years, standing at the edges, trying to keep my son close, without making it too obvious that I was trying to keep him away from the sharp edges of our family. My son Jack was 14 tall, with gangly limbs and braces that were always slightly crooked. He had this quiet, unassuming confidence that made adults either gravitate toward him or resent him for not playing their game. Jack wasn't one for appearances, and he certainly didn't care about fitting into the mold that everyone else seemed to follow. His shirt was a simple dark green polo he'd picked out himself, paired with jeans that had clearly been worn 100 times. He didn't mind. If you asked Jack what he wanted to be when he grew up, he wouldn't say rich or successful. He would say, "I want to make people feel something." He cared about stories, about creating something that left an impact. And that's why, despite the world around him trying to tell him that appearances were everything, Jack just couldn't be bothered. He stood beside me now, nervously tugging at the sleeve of his shirt, like he always did when he was bracing for something bad. I didn't know if he could sense it or if it was just instinct, but Jack had long since figured out that the worst moments at these family gatherings always came from the people who were supposed to love him. And of course, the worst arrived in heels. Olivia, my cousin, the one who always had the perfect outfit, the perfect hair, and the perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes, was making her way across the room. Behind her trailed her husband, James, who always looked like he was just trying to stay out of Olivia's way, and their 2 kids, Sophie and Liam, who had been raised to believe that designer labels were a birthright, not a luxury. Olivia spotted someone across the room, a woman in a sharp blazer, clearly someone she wanted to impress, and her eyes lit up like a light bulb. Without even asking, she hooked a hand around Jack's shoulder, dragging him along like he was some sort of accessory she was going to show off. "Come here," she said, voice as sweet as honey. Jack stiffened immediately. I didn't even think, just stepped a little closer, positioning myself between my son and the collision course Olivia had set for him. My instincts were always the same. Protect him, even if it meant going unnoticed, even if it meant sacrificing my own peace. Olivia didn't care that Jack was uncomfortable. She didn't care that he was trying to shrink into himself, trying to disappear. She just smiled, clearly enjoying herself as she led him to the woman in the blazer. "You have to meet my cousin's son," she announced with a loud, false cheer. The awkward one, always forgetting to wear a belt and trying too hard to be different. The words sliced through the air like a knife, disguised as humor. Jack stood there, frozen, staring at the floor like he could melt into it if he just focused hard enough. I could see it in the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if he was trying to make himself smaller, invisible. And in that moment, I felt a familiar sting, the kind I've felt too many times in this family, the kind that reminded me of how it felt to be the one left out, the one who didn't fit in, the one who wasn't good enough. But this time, it wasn't just me. It was my son. My heart tightened, and I had to fight the urge to snap back, to say something, anything, to stop Olivia from continuing this cruel performance. But I stayed silent, because I knew that sometimes, speaking up in these moments only made it worse. Sometimes, silence is the shield you need to protect the person you love. Olivia, oblivious to the way Jack was shrinking beside her, leaned in toward the woman in the blazer, clearly enjoying the spotlight she thought she was shining on herself. "He insists on wearing those hand-me-down clothes like they're some sort of statement," she said, her voice laced with mockery, every word dripping with false sweetness. "Doesn't know how to speak up, and honestly, with that attitude, he has no future. The words hit me like a punch in the stomach. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the urge to step forward, to call her out for treating my son this way. But I didn't. I stayed rooted in place, my hands clenched at my sides, trying to keep my composure, trying to keep my son safe. The room, at least it seemed like the room, laughed. But it wasn't the warm, genuine laughter that you'd expect in a social gathering. It was a forced, uncomfortable chuckle, a laugh that hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jack's fingers dug into the fabric of his sleeve, a silent sign that he was holding on to whatever shred of dignity he had left. His face was downcast, and I could see the weight of his discomfort settling over him like a heavy fog. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, she stood up. My grandmother, calm, composed, steady as ever. The moment she rose from her seat, the room seemed to quiet. It wasn't just the sound that stopped. It was the tension in the air. Even the clinking of forks on plates seemed to pause, like the entire room held its breath. And then my grandmother spoke. Her voice, soft but carrying, cut through the silence like a blade. "You really called him awkward in front of all these people?" she asked, her words steady, unwavering. Olivia's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. It was enough to see the shift, to see that my grandmother was done tolerating this kind of behavior. Olivia tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it as a joke, but there was no mistaking the power in my grandmother's tone. "It was just a joke," Olivia said, her voice suddenly small, defensive. My grandmother didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were sharp, deliberate. "If it's just a joke," my grandmother continued, "explain to me what's funny." There was a brief pause, one that felt like an eternity. Olivia, clearly caught off guard, stumbled over her words, trying to regain control of the situation. "Come on, Grandma. You're taking this too seriously," she said, but my grandmother wasn't having it. "No," she replied, her voice firm but calm. "I'm not taking anything seriously enough." The silence deepened, and I could see that Olivia was no longer in control of the situation. The room, once filled with forced laughter, now felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. My grandmother, without looking at anyone else in the room, turned to Jack. She stepped toward him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "Come here, Jack," she said softly. "You're safe. You're not alone." And just like that, the tension lifted. Jack looked up at her, his face softening, his shoulders relaxing, as if someone had finally given him permission to exist, to take up space. In that moment, I saw the shift. Jack didn't have to shrink anymore. Not when my grandmother was here. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe. The moment my grandmother took Jack's hand, the air in the room seemed to change. The tension, which had felt so thick just moments ago, lightened, and for the first time that night, I saw Jack's face relax. He wasn't shrinking anymore. He wasn't trying to disappear into the floor like he used to do when people hurt him with their words. His shoulders were no longer hunched, and his eyes, those deep brown eyes that always seemed to carry so much weight, were softer. He looked up at my grandmother, who was standing next to him like she'd always been his shield. She wasn't loud. She wasn't angry. She just was, and that presence of hers made everything feel a little safer. Olivia's smile had faded into something thinner, something less convincing. Her usual air of superiority seemed to slip, just for a second, and in that fleeting moment, I could see her panic. She wasn't used to losing control like this. She was used to being the one who got the last word, the one who dictated the mood of the room. But my grandmother, with her quiet strength, wasn't having any of it. "You really think it's funny to put him down in front of everyone?" my grandmother asked, her gaze steady, unwavering. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't even raising her voice. But there was something in her tone that made the room fall silent. The others, my parents included, remained quiet. I could see my father shifting uncomfortably in his chair, the kind of shift that came when someone in the room had just called out the thing you didn't want anyone to notice. Olivia, now visibly flustered, tried to brush it off. "It's just a joke, Grandma," she said with a nervous laugh, but her voice didn't hold the same conviction it had before. "You're overreacting." She wasn't just trying to defend herself now. She was trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. My grandmother didn't back down. "If it's just a joke," she replied, her voice calm and controlled. Then explain to me what's funny about humiliating someone for being different. What's funny about telling a young person that they don't matter because they don't fit your idea of what's acceptable? The words hit harder than I thought they would, and I saw Olivia's eyes flicker for a second. Surprise, embarrassment, maybe even a hint of regret. But she didn't apologize. That was never her way. The silence in the room stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, until my grandmother turned her attention back to Jack. "You are special, Jack," she said, her voice softening, "and don't you ever let anyone make you feel like you're not." I didn't even realize it at first, but my hands were trembling, and I wasn't sure if it was out of relief or anger. I'd spent so many years trying to protect Jack from the cruelty of my family, and here was my grandmother doing what I couldn't, standing up for him in a way that finally made everyone listen. Olivia had no response. The room didn't laugh this time. It didn't murmur with the same polite approval it had before. Instead, there was a moment of uncomfortable stillness. The guests at the event, who had been so eager to laugh along with Olivia, now found themselves caught in the gravity of my grandmother's words. Some shifted in their seats. Others avoided eye contact, not knowing how to react. Olivia shifted her weight, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," she muttered, but it was weak, hollow. My grandmother didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, she squeezed Jack's shoulder gently and said, "Come on, sweetheart, let's go sit down." As Jack walked with her, I felt a mix of pride and sorrow swell in my chest. I wanted to run after them, to tell my son that he was worth every second of the effort my grandmother had just made. But I stayed where I was, watching them walk away, knowing that for once, Jack didn't have to shrink anymore. When my grandmother sat Jack down at a table away from the crowd, I could feel the shift in the air. Jack looked different. He looked like he believed, for the first time in years, that he was enough. The evening dragged on after that, but it felt like the air had shifted. I could see Jack, sitting next to my grandmother, no longer curled inward, no longer playing small. He had a quiet confidence about him now, the kind that comes when you've been given permission to just be, without fear of judgment, without the need to shrink into yourself. I watched him from across the room, my heart swelling with pride. He was talking to my grandmother, leaning forward as she shared one of her stories, those rare, thoughtful tales she'd tell about her own life, the kind that always seemed to make everyone else in the room fall silent, as if they were waiting for a lesson. Olivia, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling. The playful, polished smile she'd worn earlier had faded, replaced by an awkward twitch of her lips whenever she tried to make small talk. She caught my eye once, and I saw the edge of desperation there, a hint of anger, too. But I didn't look away. I didn't need to. I knew what she was trying to do. She was trying to regain control of the situation, trying to make me feel like the one who was out of line. But for the first time, I didn't feel that familiar pull to apologize for something I hadn't done. I had nothing to apologize for. The rest of the evening passed in a strange quiet, like everyone had suddenly become self-conscious. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed too hard. Conversations were stiff, as if the invisible walls that had always divided us had suddenly become glaringly obvious. Even my parents, who had been so quick to laugh at Olivia's cruel jabs earlier, seemed hesitant now, glancing nervously between each other, trying to gauge what the right thing to say was. But my grandmother had already spoken. She had already drawn a line in the sand, and no one was going to cross it without facing the consequences. At some point, my mother came over to me, her face soft, like she was testing the waters. "Lauren, sweetheart," she began, her voice small, as if she wasn't sure if she was allowed to speak to me like this after everything that had happened. I know Olivia meant it as a joke. I cut her off before she could finish. "It wasn't funny, Mom." My voice was steady, unwavering. It was mean, and you laughed. She looked at me, startled, and I saw that flash of guilt pass across her face, quickly masked by that practiced smile of hers. "Well, it's just how things are in this family. You know how Olivia is," she said, brushing it off like it was just another part of the game we all played. But it wasn't a game anymore. It wasn't something I was willing to play along with. I glanced over at Jack, still sitting with my grandmother, His head tilted slightly as she spoke, her words quiet but filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes with time and experience. Jack didn't need to be part of their game. He wasn't some pawn to be poked at for entertainment. My mother hesitated, then glanced at my grandmother across the room, who was still engaged in a conversation with Jack, her hand resting lightly on his. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, as if admitting something to herself. "Maybe we've been too focused on the wrong things." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at my mother, my heart heavy with the weight of all the things that had been left unsaid for so long. "It's not about what they say, Mom," I said quietly. "It's about what we allow." I didn't need to say more. She understood. She had to. The rest of the night passed in silence between us, but the tension had lifted, and when Jack and I left later, it felt like we were stepping into a new world, one where he wasn't the outsider, where he didn't have to apologize for being exactly who he was. The weight of the evening still hung in the air, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like the family was finally starting to see things clearly. The days after the wedding were strange, a quiet kind of strange. Jack and I had been through so much in that one evening, so much change packed into just a few hours, that it was hard to even process it all. The phone calls and messages from relatives began trickling in the next day, the ones that tried to pretend like nothing had happened. Nicole, of course, was the first one to text me, her message sugary sweet and riddled with backhanded apologies. "I'm really sorry if I said something that upset Jack last night, but you know how I joke around." I read it and then deleted it. I didn't need to dignify it with a response. What really struck me, though, were the phone calls from my mother. The first one was a couple of hours after the event had ended. Her voice was soft, uncertain, like she wasn't sure what role she was supposed to play now. "Lauren, honey, I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay after all that." I could hear the guilt in her voice, but I wasn't ready to forgive it yet. Not when they'd all been so quick to laugh at Jack's expense the night before. I didn't pick up. The second call came the next day, and by then I was feeling more grounded, more sure of the decision I'd made. When I answered, my mom didn't waste any time. "I know I wasn't the best in that moment, but Lauren, that's how we've always done things, you know? That's how things have always been in this family." She sounded like she was trying to justify it, trying to explain it away like it was something that couldn't be changed. "No," I said, my voice firmer this time. "It's how you have always done things. But it's not how I'm going to do things anymore." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she finally spoke. "I didn't mean to hurt Jack," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt either of you." I almost felt bad for her, but I didn't. Not anymore. Jack didn't deserve to be laughed at. I wasn't going to apologize for standing up for him. That was the turning point. The conversation we'd avoided for so long. My mom didn't like it, but she couldn't argue with the truth. Slowly, I started to realize that this wasn't just about Olivia or my parents. This was about breaking patterns, about changing the way our family interacted. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was starting. And for the first time, I wasn't the one stuck cleaning up the mess that everyone else left behind. The next few days, though, felt like walking through fog. I didn't know what would come next. The family, as expected, had started whispering behind our backs. There were questions about the wedding, about Jack's future, about the way things had gone down with Grandma. Some of them tried to act like nothing was wrong, but I could hear the undercurrent of discomfort in every conversation. It was like they were all waiting for me to break. But I didn't. And neither did Jack. One afternoon, a week after the wedding, I found him in his room, bent over his sewing machine, working on a new design. He didn't look up when I walked in, but I didn't need him to. There was a steady hum in the air, the sound of Jack's creativity filling the silence. It was like he had found his center again, the place where he was just him. No apologies, no explanations. "Mom," he said quietly, still focused on his project, "do you think Grandma's really going to leave me everything?" I paused. The question hung in the air, heavier than I wanted it to be. "She's already made her decision, Jack," I said softly, "and I think she knows exactly who's worth it." He nodded, not looking up, but I saw the faintest smile tug at his lips. He was starting to believe it. starting to believe that he mattered. And so was I. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking in the right direction. It wasn't about the inheritance or the company or the money. It was about respect, about standing firm in who we were, no matter what anyone else thought. My grandmother had given us that, and it was something no one could take away. We had our little world, and it was enough. The weeks that followed felt like a slow unraveling of the life I thought I knew, but in the best way possible. There was a shift in how I interacted with the family. I didn't feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me anymore. I wasn't constantly seeking approval, and I wasn't apologizing for existing in a space where my values didn't align with theirs. And the more I held my ground, the more I realized that this was the life I wanted for Jack, too. A life where we didn't have to shrink, where we didn't have to pretend. Jack had come into his own in a way I hadn't anticipated. His sewing machine became more than just a tool. It became his way of processing everything. He wasn't just learning how to make clothes anymore. He was learning how to stitch together pieces of himself that had always been ignored, hidden, or ridiculed. The clothes he made weren't just functional. They were an expression of who he was, of the quiet strength he'd always had, but never had the chance to show. His designs were simple, often a bit rough around the edges, but there was something in every stitch that made them real, and I couldn't have been prouder. One day, a month or so after the wedding, Jack asked me to come look at something he'd been working on. I was in the middle of a call with a client, but I could hear the excitement in his voice, so I excused myself and walked into his room. He was standing by the window, his back to me, holding up a finished piece, a jacket, simple but undeniably his own. The fabric was deep blue, almost like the night sky, and the stitching was clean, more refined than anything I had seen him do before. He turned around and looked at me, his eyes wide with the pride he'd never let himself feel before. "Do you think this is good?" he asked, his voice a little hesitant, but more confident than I'd ever heard him. I smiled, feeling that lump in my throat that always came when I realized just how much he'd grown. "It's perfect, Jack. It's exactly what you've been working for." He grinned and shrugged, his usual self-deprecating humor kicking in. "I guess I'm not so bad at this, huh?" "You're amazing at this," I said, and for once I wasn't just saying the words because I was his mom. I truly believed them. "You know, I think Grandma would be really proud." Jack's smile faltered just a bit at the mention of her, but I saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I know she would," he said, a quiet certainty in his voice. And I realized then that we were okay. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living, truly living. And that had everything to do with the decisions we'd made to protect each other, to shield ourselves from the toxicity that had always run through the veins of our family. We had finally built something of our own, something no one could take away, no matter how much they tried to tear us down. The phone calls and messages from family kept coming, of course. The whispers behind our backs didn't stop. But Jack and I had found a way to protect our peace, and the more we did, the less the noise from the outside mattered. The more I focused on the life we were building, the less I cared about what anyone else thought. Then one afternoon, I got a call that I wasn't expecting. It was from my grandmother's lawyer, informing me that she had officially changed the will. The entire company, the one that my parents and Olivia had thought they'd inherit, had been signed over to Jack. Not as a favor or an act of sentimentality, but because my grandmother had seen the work he'd put in, the dedication he had to learning, to growing, to creating something real. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about the money. It was about something much bigger. Jack wasn't just inheriting a company. He was inheriting the legacy of resilience, of craftsmanship, and most importantly, of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. The shift in our family had already begun, and though I knew there would still be challenges ahead, I also knew that we would face them together. The days after that call from the lawyer felt surreal, like I was stepping into a new chapter of our lives, one where I didn't have to apologize or shrink in the face of others' expectations. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few months, the family drama, the hurtful comments, the long-standing patterns of behavior, it all started to feel less important. I was learning, slowly but surely, how to put my focus where it mattered. On Jack, on us, and on the future we were building together. Jack, for his part, had taken the news with a quiet calm, like he wasn't surprised, but also wasn't sure what it would mean for him. The change in the will had shaken him, but in a way that was almost freeing. It was like a heavy weight had been lifted off his shoulders, the weight of trying to live up to others' expectations, of being made to feel small. He spent more time in his room, working on his designs, more focused than ever. There was a quiet intensity about him now, a determination that I hadn't seen before. He wasn't just making clothes anymore. He was making something that was his, something that belonged to him and no one else. I watched him from the doorway one evening, his sewing machine humming steadily in the background as he carefully stitched a new piece, his brow furrowed in concentration. I wasn't sure what he was thinking, but I could see how much he was growing into himself. He wasn't the awkward kid who couldn't speak up. He wasn't the shy teenager who kept to the sidelines. He was someone who had learned to find his voice, who had learned that the world didn't get to decide who he was or what he could accomplish. And I felt so proud of him in that moment, proud of how far he had come. One evening after dinner, Jack came to me and said something that I hadn't expected. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I want to take over the business." I stopped, my fork halfway to my mouth, unsure if I had heard him right. "What do you mean?" I asked, setting the fork down and giving him my full attention. "The company," he clarified. "Grandma's business. I want to run it, not because it's mine now, but because I think I could do something good with it. Something real." I was stunned, but in a good way. I knew this day was coming, knew that Jack had it in him, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel like a dream. "You're sure?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "It's a big responsibility, a lot of work." He nodded, his eyes steady and sure. "I know, but it's what I want. I don't want to be the guy who just takes what was handed to me. I want to build something of my own, on my own terms." And just like that, I knew that Jack was ready. He had been ready for a while, even if I hadn't fully recognized it. He had been shaping himself in the quiet hours, working when no one was watching, learning the skills that no one thought mattered. And now, it was all coming together. Over the next few weeks, we started the process of getting everything in order: documents, meetings with the lawyer, and getting Jack officially involved in the business. My parents and Olivia continued to call and send messages, but their words had lost their sting. They were still clinging to old habits, still trying to guilt-trip me into apologizing, but I wasn't having it anymore. I had made my peace with that chapter of my life. Jack and I were moving forward, and nothing they said could change that. When we finally sat down with the team at my grandmother's company, Jack was quiet but confident. He spoke to them like he had been doing this his entire life. He didn't need anyone's approval. He didn't need anyone to tell him he was capable. He already knew. And I knew too. This was the beginning of something real for both of us. Jack was no longer the kid who had to apologize for being different. He was the one creating the future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were exactly where we were meant to be. A few months had passed since the day Jack made his decision to take over the business. We were settling into our new rhythm, him diving deeper into the world my grandmother had built, and me adjusting to the reality of having a son who was now both a creator and a leader in his own right. The transition wasn't easy, not by any means. There were long hours spent poring over documents, meetings with lawyers and accountants, and the inevitable questions about the future that hung in the air like a cloud. But in between all of that, there was also this quiet certainty that had settled over us. Jack had claimed his space, and the weight of what had happened, the family drama, the mockery, the years of trying to fit into a world that wasn't made for us, no longer felt like an anchor holding us back. We were free. One evening, about 3 months into Jack's new role at the company, he came into the kitchen, his face lit up by the glow of the desk lamp, still on in his room. He had been working late again, piecing together designs and refining plans for the new collections he wanted to launch under the company name. His eyes were bright with that same determination he had shown when he first started sewing. But this time, there was something different. There was a sense of ownership in his expression, a quiet confidence that spoke volumes about how far he had come. "Mom," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "I think I want to open our own showroom." His voice was steady, like this wasn't just some passing idea, but a well-thought-out plan. Not just a regular showroom, something that shows what the business is about, the craft, the quality, the real work behind everything. I want it to reflect us, not just the clothes. I paused, wiping my hands on the dish towel as I considered his words. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken about expanding the business, but it was the first time he'd sounded so sure. Jack had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred to work behind the scenes, letting his creations speak for themselves. But now it was clear. He wanted the world to see him, to see what he could build with his own hands. And I couldn't have been prouder of him. "That sounds like an amazing idea," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "What do you need from me to make it happen?" Jack's smile spread across his face, and for a moment, he looked like the 14-year-old kid I used to worry about, the one who felt out of place. But in his eyes, there was a new fire now, one that had been nurtured by hard work, by rejection, and by the quiet moments of resilience he had built over time. "I'll need your help to set things up. Maybe we can get a small team together to help with the launch. I want to keep it simple, but I want it to be perfect." It was amazing to see how far he had come from the days when he would shy away from attention, when the idea of standing in front of a crowd or making big decisions seemed terrifying. Now, he was the one driving this ship, and I was following his lead. It was humbling, honestly. Watching your child grow into someone who is so unapologetically themselves is a kind of magic that I didn't know existed until I saw it in Jack. Over the next few weeks, we began to make plans for the showroom. It was strange to think that not so long ago, Jack had been the one standing on the sidelines, feeling like he didn't fit in. And now, here he was, ready to take the next step in building something that was entirely his own. We worked together, hashing out ideas and collaborating on the vision he had for this new venture. And in those moments, I felt more connected to him than I ever had before. The day we opened the showroom, Jack stood at the front, greeting the small crowd that had gathered, his hands steady as he spoke. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just watching him grow. I was walking beside him every step of the way. And that was enough. Life is a journey full of unexpected twists. But here's a solid tip. Always stay true to yourself, even when others try to push you into their mold. It's your uniqueness that will set you apart in the end. So, embrace the weirdness, keep pushing forward, and don't let anyone dim your shine, whether they're a family member or a stranger. And hey, if you love a good dose of life lessons and unexpected comebacks, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on the Revenge Protocol YouTube channel. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. Let's keep this revolution rolling.